I'm Michael Lynch. I'm president of Strategic Energy and Economic Research.
Thank you very much for joining the program here. First off, talk about what it is that you guys do as the organization that you're in charge of there.
Well, we do energy economics and policy is the short thing. We do a lot of forecasting. We look at where oil and gas prices are going and how that affects different businesses in the energy sector. And also, having done this for many years, I feel like I'm in the position to comment on policy making, good and bad, mostly the bad, I'm afraid.
So let's talk a little bit about first off, ACE. This is in the books. It's currently in the process of happening, so to speak. Has any of your research or any of your policy overlooking, has that come into play at all in your offices, or have you guys looked elsewhere?
A bit of both. We spend a lot of time arguing about, for example, that people do not have a good understanding of the nature of resources. That you get what I refer to as neo-Malthusian pessimism, where so many people think we're running out of oil and gas. We can't feed the population and so forth. And so we try to argue against that, but also that free markets are generally a much better way of allocating resources. We argue in favor of things like pipelines, for example, but also exports, ending export restrictions on oil and gas, which has mostly been accomplished now in this country.
How about natural gas? Do you guys do much in the terms of natural gas? A lot of flaring going on, a lot of opportunity out there for natural gas.
Yeah, I mean, the fact of the matter is that natural gas has a lot of advantages. It's the cleanest fossil fuel. It works very well in a lot of applications, better than most other types of energy, including some would say electricity, for example, for space heating. The problem is that it is relatively expensive to transport, especially overseas, and the market internationally tends to be somewhat restricted by monopolies and past practices, so that on a global level, natural gas is used a lot less than it should be. And I think the U.S. LNG export business is really making a big difference in that sector.
One of the things that we've talked about in this program, pontificated, if you will, and we're relatively a non-political program. We'll talk about policy, but we stay out of most of the political banter and debates. But one of the things that we have raised the question of is, what would the world look like if we shifted subsidies away from, say, solar and wind, who've had a pretty good run of subsidies for 40 years, but let's say we shifted those to natural gas. And my belief is there's a lot of innovation out there in the natural gas world that if energy companies were able to tap into some additional funds, because at least up in my neck of the woods, up in the Bakken, they're taxed very heavily. The oil companies are. They make sure that the Little League teams have baseball uniforms and the churches have bake sales, and sometimes they just don't have enough money left over for research and development. And this would allow some natural gas providers that are crazy enough to sleep on these well sites and check monitors every day, and just it would create a whole different little sub economy type of a thing in my mind. What do you make of something like that? Or if you shifted some subsidies, because I believe the flaring issue could be solved in 5 years, and who knows what we'd come out of it? Maybe just some new super plastic that you can build a house with. I don't know. I'm just.
As a matter of fact, 20 minutes ago, literally, a friend on Twitter commented on the environmental damage from the mining of sand to make concrete. And I commented, maybe we need more plastic and less concrete. Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, so much of policy making and thinking is based on cliches and beliefs that are not well founded. A lot more natural gas should be used in places around the world where people use, quote unquote, biomass, which is to say, we'll say cow poop, to be polite for your listeners. And also, I mean, there's still huge amounts of coal, and yet people run around saying, "Oh, if only we didn't use natural gas in Berkeley, California, the world would be saved." And that's just utter nonsense. And that's not political. That's I think. The problem is how do you use natural gas in places like the Bakken, where there's not ready consumers. But you have a superabundance of supply, and certainly there's a lot of things you can do with hydrocarbons generally and methane in particular that we haven't really exploited as much as we have. As you say, the people in the environmental community like to talk about the huge subsidies for fossil fuels. And usually what they mean is that gasoline in Iran is 3 cents a gallon, not that oil and gas in the U.S. is subsidized particularly. So the amount of money going into building solar panels, which are very poor technology, just seriously inadequate in most uses, versus natural gas, which is heavily taxed and reduces pollution, it's just kind of shocking, and it does give a sense of how much the public can, we'll say, be led astray.
Well, our thoughts are that the benchmarks and the milestones, those were put out by the solar and wind companies over the last 40 years. So this is the part that I think a real adult conversation needs to be had within the policymakers. That after 40 years. And we've been very upfront on this program that solar promised us affordable energy for the last 40 years, and then they really promised it 20 years ago. And they still are not, in all honesty, the most affordable thing that solar is now provided is probably a cell phone charger type technology when you go camping. And I'm being serious. That's about the most affordable thing that's probably efficient, correct?
Yes, and if you're in an isolated village in Africa or South America, and
Sure.
you don't have electric appliances, but you want to charge your cell phone, that's great because you don't care. You can charge the battery and walk away. Whereas if you tell somebody, okay, you can cook your turkey for 40 minutes and then come back in 2 hours and cook it another 40 minutes, no consumer wants that.
No, and then even in wind now, we're on record saying that 100 years ago the farmers were more efficient with wind energy than we are today. The way the farmers, they extracted water out of the earth, and the way that they powered their pole barn and their barn by using a windmill, that is much more efficient than we are today with wind energy. And for as far as risk and reward and that sort of thing. Talk to me a little bit about that. How they've had 40 years to really come up with something that was supposed to be affordable. What happened?
Well, I'll tell you. Okay, so I have a chapter in my book, The Peak Oil Scare, in which I talk about how a lot of these technologies get promoted, and I guess you could say over-promoted, and people who like a technology, they don't think critically about it. And you can easily find, especially in the internet era, you can find all kinds of references to research about new wonderful technologies. And the problem is that a lot of things can be done in the laboratory, and they just don't work out in the real world. I was at MIT for many years, and I knew all kinds of professors who had all kinds of great ideas, and the vast majority of them never paid out. You can see this in electric vehicle batteries. People have been talking about the great advances for 20 years, and they're still not very good. I mean, they're better, but they're nowhere near good enough. And the problem is that, you can always find somebody, an inventor, who will tell you, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. And if you say, what does it cost? And I mean, I've literally seen MIT professors ask that question, and they just stare blankly and go, well, or, but it works great. You can make gasoline out of urine, and I'm sure Budweiser would like to provide some subsidies for that. But it costs a heck of a lot of money, and you can just pump the stuff out of the ground. So the problem is that a lot of policy making gets done by people who don't really know what they're doing and who just have very fuzzy, green pie in the sky ideas. And they, especially, I hate to say this, the younger folks, I constantly run into them and I say, yeah, I heard about that 30 years ago and I'm still waiting. So, for example, 25, 30 years ago, some people at MIT said, we have a paint, you can spray it on your house, and the silicon cells will line up and you'll get electric power. Now, it's not ready to be marketed or commercialized yet, but it's technically feasible. Well, that was 30 years ago, and people are still working on that, and it's not even close yet. So people need to think a little more critically when they read things on the internet.
Or they need to follow it a little more closely and get burned by the terawatt of solar storage promise and things like that. I mean, honestly, you feel stupid after the fifth, sixth, seventh time. I mean, because they keep coming back and they say they're going to get there, and then you get excited, and then it's not there. And, God bless them for trying and keeping it up, but at some point, you have to say, okay, when's enough? I did want to ask you about the perception of the modern day environmentalist, because it's really become an influence on what's going on in the oil and gas industry. I mean, look at what happened at Colorado, BLM in Wyoming. And like I've mentioned, we have two presidential candidates, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, actively talking about banning the industry in their platform. So it's part of the, at least one side of the political aisle's public, conversation, which is, to me, a little bit concerning, because when I grew up, the light switch was not political. And this is, I've seen the evolution now. We've followed this for about 5 years on our program, the rise of the environmentalist, to where we've now, this last year, have changed it to where we flat out call it, by its literal term, the cult of environmentalism. And there's so much blind faith that's being followed and so much just herd mentality that's going on. Cult really does seem to be the appropriate term. And when you look at what's happened with the modern day environmentalism, there's some real interesting irony here. And we're on record saying this, and I'd love to get your opinion or your reaction to this, is that today's environmentalist has become a texting, trolling, Keurig drinking, carbon waste zone, whereas the oil and gas industry is now the new leader in the environmental movement to save the planet. They're the ones that are doing the investment in innovation, and some of the things they've done with reclamation, you can kind of, say that they're like a Boy Scout. They leave the place better than when they got there. And there's a lot of truth behind that, because, I don't know if you're aware of the cell phone thing, but cell phones really are the number one polluter on the planet. So if environmentalists are spending most of their time just texting and trolling, they're causing more problem than they are, so anyway, your thought on that.
No, I take your point, and there's a couple of examples where you rarely, if ever, hear environmentalists criticize Germany. Germany has spent a huge amount on wind and solar, and their carbon emissions are higher than ever because they shut in nuclear power plants at the Fukushima, even though Germany has probably not had a tsunami in 300 million years. And they're burning lignite, which is pretty much the dirtiest thing, the dirtiest fossil fuel. I mean, I guess dung is dirtier in a lot of ways, and you compare that with the U.S., where our carbon emissions have gone down, especially because of cheap natural gas, and yet no environmentalist would praise America for addressing climate change or greenhouse gas emissions. It is. There are environmentalists, some who are basically, scientists who are trying to look at numbers and think about things, and some of them will come around and say, if we use nuclear power instead of coal, that's good. And some will say, genetically modified organisms is a more efficient way of growing food, and that's good. And some of them will say, natural gas is better in a lot of places than just about anything else. I mean, I appreciate the Environmental Defense Fund going out and saying, where's the methane leakage? Okay, it's not the wells, it's the pipes, and we can fix that. That's rational, but then you get the Sierra Club or somebody saying we have to stop using fossil fuels in 8 years. And I always say, if you don't like, I don't know how old you are. In the '60s, they said if you don't like cops, next time you mug, call a hippie. And I always say, if you don't like fossil fuels, next time you break a leg, bike to the ER.
I've never heard that. If you get mugged, you don't like cops, call a hippie.
Right. that was See, I'm dating myself on that. That was the '60s.
Oh, to me that transcends time. That's gold anytime in my book. So,
okay.
What do you make about coal? Coal seems to keep losing ground. It's made some amazing innovations over the last 10 years, 15 years. I mean, I'm from North Dakota, where we've got, I think, the cleanest air in the nation, and 70 to 90% of our state's powered by coal.
Mm-hmm. Well, so I knew people who were working on Chinese energy, and until about 20 years ago in China, people burned lump coal in their houses, and that was a cause of huge pollution. And they sort of said, if you wash the coal, you reduce the pollution substantially. And if you burn it in big plants instead of little, open stoves in kitchens, that makes a big difference. One of my colleagues at a company that makes power plants actually told me that a modern Chinese coal plant, a new one, is cleaner than the average American plant, which tend to be a lot older. You can definitely clean up coal a lot. You can't fix CO2 without doing some kind of extraction and sequestration, which, that's a whole nother question, and that's an area where I think the technology is moving forward. But, it's hard to go out to people who are impoverished in India, for example, and tell them, as Enron tried to do, you need really expensive clean power. That's just not going to work. I think in the short run, I'd like to see, for example, a lot more gas pipelines to Asia to displace all that coal. But I do think that, the future is not coal any more than it is. Very few people burn wood for power, although we still have a big timber industry. And I have a cousin who actually makes building materials out of coal, which is kind of unusual, but he's an unusual guy.
Well, it wouldn't surprise me if they found another use for it.
He turns it into something he calls Seafoam, which it literally looks and feels like styrofoam, but it's black and it's highly heat resistant. And actually, the Navy uses it, and they use it for rocket engine cones because it's so heat resistant and very lightweight. I don't know the economics, but he's making a lot of money off it.
That's the one thing I absolutely love about the energy industry. That's what I fell in love with and started covering it, was because it's kind of like the last essence of capitalism, the last bastion for capitalism. It just seems like the energy industry still, you can be a roughneck one week and then the next week you're an inventor, and then all of a sudden, you got a great contract with Marathon a couple weeks later because you got a vibrating tube that saved them money. I mean,
Yeah. Well, it's a question. This is where I run into a lot of problems with people saying, well, we'll tell the car companies to make more efficient cars, and I say, you have to tell the consumers that you have to get the consumers to want more efficient cars. You can't legislate consumer desires. People need energy, and entrepreneurs go out and try to satisfy that need. Whereas the government tries to sit down and figure out, well, what exactly should we do instead of energy, or, how should the government provide it? And again, I hate to date myself, but I still have documents from the Carter administration where they talked about how we're running out of natural gas, and, we should only burn coal instead of gas for power, things like that. And it was all based on a few really bad economic studies. And frankly, they didn't listen to the experts. They listened to the people they thought were the experts, who all turned out to be horribly wrong.
What do you make about the Green New Deal? That to me, it seems like it's words like impossible, or not impossible, but well, extremely difficult. I mean, radical, and it would be a very accurate word. Radical would be.
Yeah, I mean, it's partly it's done by committee, so then they let everybody throw in, and we want more jobs and more social justice and better health care and that. And it's kind of like when you go to a condo sales pitch and they go, oh yeah, and you have cancer. Well, no problem. Buy this condo; it'll cure your cancer. And it's very aspirational, and very imaginative. But it's there's no effort to be realistic. And they always say, oh, well, we'll make lots of jobs. It's like, well, no, you're not going to create jobs. You're going to take jobs, you're going to tax people and destroy jobs, and then create new jobs that you think, and less jobs that you happen to approve of ideologically. Because technically, back in the Depression, they said, oh, you're creating jobs, but they're just digging ditches. And I said, the modern equivalent of that is, to dig a ditch from the mountains down to the shore and let water run down and get hydro and pretend that, oh, look, we created a lot of jobs while you're taxing other jobs out of existence. The whole idea of, we can sort of have 0%, fossil fuel consumption or emissions or whatever, you hear this all the time. Oh, we're going to end homelessness, even though we've always had homelessness throughout human history. Somehow we're going to end it, or poverty, or hunger. No, you want to improve the situation, but you can't like wave a magic wand and say we're going to get rid of all this. We're going to have completely carbon neutral energy, especially when you consider that windmills and solar panels require a huge amount of energy to create.
About 3 years ago, I was at a conference and they showed a big screen up on the projection screen, I guess, and it had to do with mining. The mining industry was the only industry that added jobs over the past decade. When you looked at all the different, technology sector, medical, all these different sectors, the mining industry after 10 years was the only one that had a net gain. And then they broke it down even a step further and said it was basically because of oil and gas, because the silver industry wasn't quite growing in the U.S. and the the other mining industries, so to speak. So it was U.S. that was doing all this, or I'm sorry, oil and gas that was doing all this. It seems kind of odd that they're trying to put the one industry that has created jobs, a net gain of jobs for the past 10 years, they're trying to put it out of business in 10 years.
It's politically incorrect to say, the Jews do this, the Irish do this, but you can say, oh, the banks do this, or the oil companies do this, and it's considered okay. It's kind of astonishing. I was debating with a guy who's an ethanol supporter, and he said, well, the oil companies are unpatriotic because they supported the Nazis in World War II. And I said, well, okay, so the CEO of Shell in the 30s was a Nazi supporter, but, do you not drive cars because Volkswagen, was created by the Nazis? I mean, that's ridiculous. But people, I think, have switched their prejudices in part from racial and ethnic groups to types of organizations and also chemicals, where you sort of go, oh, this chemical, here we have a seed it was modified in a laboratory as opposed to by an Aztec farmer 1,000 years ago. So it if it's done in a laboratory or if it's done for profit, it's no good. Whereas if it's done, by an indigenous person, it's somehow special. You'd like to think that humans had gotten smarter over the years, but sometimes I have my doubts.
Well, it's interesting about how the energy industry really has changed. Like I said, back when I was in junior high, the energy industry really wasn't political. Gas prices people would complain about, but for the most part, there was a BP spill up in the Alaska area. Or Exxon was up there, and then BP was down in the Gulf. Basically, I've had like two major ones in my lifetime, and those weren't even really political. It was just like a tragedy. It was like it's just like a natural disaster, kind of the way it was really approached or treated. The political stuff came afterwards, but go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, it's sort of the target of the day. And I can remember in the 70s an anti-nuclear activist, and I sort of said, what's the next issue after you get bored with nuclear power? And she was like, oh no, we'll never be bored. And there hasn't been a march against a nuclear power plant in this country in, I don't know, 25 years or something. It is oil, but maybe the next thing will be the pharmaceutical companies, or the power companies, or the banks. Will be the next big target. But there's always sort of an activist community, I think, that goes out and looks for targets, and there's a lot of times there's some fire amidst all the smoke. But what you find is the difference between people who say, we need to tweak this, as opposed to the people who say we need to burn it down. And in the Great Depression, the problem was, instead of people saying we need better banking regulation, you had people saying, oh, capitalism doesn't work, let's go for communism, or let's go for fascism. And that turned out to be just completely wrong, in my opinion. And I think you see a lot of that now today with some of the politicians who sort of say, no, you can't fix the system. It needs to be completely, renovated or destroyed. I look at it and I go, well, no, you're just talking about tweaking this here and there, and that will take care of 80% of the problems. But again, you get into kind of human nature, which is I'd rather have a chant than a policy proposal.
Oh, I see where you're coming from, and I'd agree and go a little step further by saying, everyone's an activist now because they have a cell phone, and that cell phone has a mobile media company within it. They used to say, everyone's got their 15 minutes of fame, but really now you got your 15 followers. So going from there, it's interesting because the activists have always been there, and now they can be more impulsive, and they've got, more ability to have an outlet, I guess. And that there's more activism now, but that doesn't mean it's getting any bigger, because a lot of it goes by the wayside. Nobody sees it. There's more noise, so to speak. But here's the thing that I've been following, and we've had a few discussions on this program about it, and had to do with the politicizing of energy, to where when you look at what the energy companies have done, and rightfully so during its time, they invested a lot of money into government relations. They kind of did away with traditional public relations and marketing, went kind of on a local level, and then government affairs. And then over the last decade, really the blue and red polarization happened very quickly, and to where energy all of a sudden got lumped in with gun control and right to life issue. It just became kind of a black and white, red and blue type of a thing, and oil and gas got thrown into the one side of the aisle, And
right.
So to me, I look at this as a golden time, and a very paradigm shifting time. We've had a number of CEOs talk about the paradigm shift on this program, with hydraulic fracturing and drilling. And then you take a look at what big data has done to HR departments and monitoring and censoring. Now it's time to maybe paradigm shift the way they're doing PR and public relations, because they've been very reactive over the last 10 years. And they don't need to be now. I mean, we talked earlier about the modern day contemporary environmentalist has really changed and become more of a polluter than a solution. More pollution than solution. There we go. There's your rhyme. More pollution than solution. What do you make of that, as far as the energy companies maybe should look at how they're engaging with the public and how they're doing their public relations? Because in my opinion, it seems like they've really, now the politicians have become their PR spokespeople.
There's some truth to that. I mean, one thing that bothers me is a CEO is not a PR person. A CEO is supposed to manage a company, but I saw some video where somebody in Congress was asking the CEO of Exxon, well, why are oil prices high? And he was trying to think of a polite way to say, that's not in my job description. The problem is that public relations becomes political within companies, and you can get all kinds of problems there. We had a case. I knew a professor who, in the 70s, was very critical of Saudi Arabia, and Mobil was trying to do research, trying to invest in Saudi Arabia. So they ordered people not to visit MIT because they just didn't approve of this professor. So that could be a problem. And that's one reason it's the old, leave it to the professionals. You should have a good PR department. You should focus a lot, I think, on education. And because there's just so much misunderstanding. I've in discussing fracking online, occasionally I get people and they'll say just the wildest things, and you sort of want to go, well, if you don't like it when Donald Trump says something that you think is wrong, why would you listen to, say, David Letterman when he says the Delaware River Valley has been destroyed by fracking, which he literally said. Or there's I have it here somewhere, an ad from a full-page ad in the New York Times by Yoko Ono saying, Mr. Obama, how are you going to tell your children that the grandchildren will not have a planet to live on because of fracking? And it's like, fracking, it's not like making cupcakes, but it's not that different from, the rest of American industry. There's chemicals and there's workers, and, that's life, and you don't want people dumping the chemicals in the stream, but we have regulations for that, and people are not doing that. But it gets so, I think you would say, religious, cultish, where it's sort of, X is good and Y is bad, and nothing else matters. And the industry, I think, needs to simply try to parse things. It is hard to have a conference and have somebody get up for 10 minutes and say oil is evil, and somebody else get up and say oil is good. But I've been engaged, for example, in the peak oil debate, where I was able to, put up graphs and talk about real numbers with people, and at least convince some of them. The true believers are always going to be true believers, but I think there are a lot of people out in the middle that you can talk to.
I think one of the things that I've noticed is the energy industry is very technical, and it becomes very much facts and very science-based, and the activists have really seen a lot of progress hitting the emotional triggers.
Yes.
And that's the one thing I think that the energy industry, I think, needs to kind of reinvent themselves as far as that paradigm shift I'm talking about, to where that might be a different way to approach it, because it's almost like and I've seen it firsthand, and I have been critical with the industry on this over the past month. I spoke recently at a couple conferences, and I said, me included, with I have a program called the Crude Life. I mean, we're very oil and gas energy centric, and at the same time, we have to be very aware of what's going on, because over the last 10 years, the industry's made more money and spent more money than any other 10-year period in their history. They had $100 oil. I mean, just huge dollars. And at the end of 10 years, you just got banned in Colorado, and Wyoming's BLM is banning you, and Oregon is trying to do the same ban there, and 2 presidential candidates are talking about banning the industry, and then you got the new Green Deal. So it's a tough conversation to have, but it needs to be had. And, because otherwise, who knows what's going to happen? The emotional herd mentality will just keep going.
Yeah, when I was writing about the Dakota pipeline, one of the things I pointed out was that, there's lots of energy installations in North and South Dakota. This is so the idea that, one more pipeline, or in Massachusetts, we have 5,000 miles of natural gas pipelines, and people talk about how a 100-mile extension would destroy the state. But you get down and you try to, talk to people about facts and context, and I think, again, you can reach the reasonable middle, and you can discredit the unreasonable extremes, I think, by pointing out, just pointing to reality and trying to be reasonable and rational, and not just throwing bricks.
True story. When the Dakota Access Pipeline happened, I was interviewed by the BBC because of the coverage we did on it. We were one of the few that was non-political, and we had on some people from the protest and everything, and I went out there to meet with some environmentalists to give their side of it. True story. They served me a Keurig coffee. That's why when I say the texting, trolling, Keurig coffee drinking, that's where that comes from. I ended the interview. I left. I said no.
Well, I used to hold on. You're fading out. Let me switch phones here.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, no. I ended the interview because it was hypocritical for them to be protesting a major environmental issue and then serve me a Keurig coffee cup, which is
in one of my Forbes pieces, I had a picture of the protest site where you could see acres and acres of pickups and SUVs and RVs and stuff, and it's like I kind of doubt they're all fueled with ethanol grown in their backyard. Well,
not only that, but then the trash that was left behind. A lot of people focus on the fact that they'd left trash behind. No, it's the type of trash that was left behind. That's the part that is so hilarious to me. And I don't mean hilarious in a very positive way, just that the texting, the trolling. I mean, you can throw in there the potato chip eating, the ding dong eating. I mean, they weren't growing, their own vegetables out there. Not that, they spent enough time they could have, but it was all, plastic covered disposable stuff for the most part that was left behind. And so, anyway, so,
just one quick
go ahead.
Anecdote. We have a local, natural foods, store, and in the summertime they'll have displays, and let's say, like these carrots were delivered by bicycle from a nearby farm. And then maybe 30 feet away, there'll be a stack of mineral water that was delivered from Italy. So,
It's all about balance, right? The offset. The biker offsets the ship and the rail and and everything else, right? That's great. Talk to me about what's next for you guys as far as make sure you give yourself a plug, what you guys are working on. I don't know. How are you guys? You're MIT, right?
I used to be. I'm now a consultant, and I work, actually, I'm also a fellow with the Energy Policy Research Foundation in Washington, which focuses on petroleum issues especially.
Okay.
We're trying to convince the Mexican government to be a little more free market. I've been working on the LNG business and sort of, dealing with the risks that the LNG exporters face and how to cope with them. And also, there are a certain segment of the analyst community who are telling us that shale is on the verge of collapse and probably should be, that they're spending too much, that decline rates are too high, and so forth. And I've been going into the numbers and sort of saying a lot of that is exaggerated. It's like, yes, a company had tried an experiment and it didn't work well, and so they'll try something else. But that's not the same as saying the industry can't cope with low recovery rates or anything.
Boy, I tell you, we'd love to have you back on the program to talk about that, because we've been following that for about 5 years now, the Mexican LNG market. And if that could just get opened up in a way that the potential is there, it would just be, and that's one of those, getting back to the natural gas subsidies things, there's another thing there that would just help that market considerably. Anyway, so, Mike Lynch with Strategic Energy and Economic Research, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, great.
That's right.
And so you're a consultant, so you'll take on customers. So how can people get in touch with you? You always get, one thing we like to let people do is plug their business or plug their way to get some business and that sort of stuff. Appreciate you coming on and sharing your mind.
No, sure, it's been fun, Jason.